I want to bring in Bill Kristol, founding director of Defending Democracy Together. Richard Stengel served in the Biden State Department and is an MS Now political analyst. Bill, traditionally, times of war, with American military lives at risk, Americans have rallied behind their commander-in-chief. Some instant polls have suggested they're not doing that this time. Do you think if that holds true, it could have serious political implications for Republicans overall?
Yeah, it sure could. I mean, I was there watching closely the Iraq War, which started out with a lot of bipartisan support and started out, with reasonable support in the first few weeks, and then obviously started to go south in a big way. For me, the lesson of that and of all these other wars too is what happens depends on what people's judgments are depend on what happens. It's very event specific and event dependent, so to speak. If the war goes well, Trump will get credit for taking out the Ayatollah and maybe leaving Iran in a somewhat better place and not having a big Middle East conflagration. If things go poorly, the downside is pretty great, I think, for Trump. Don't you think? I mean, I just feel like there's so many things that can go wrong, unfortunately, for the U.S. and for the region and for the world. And those feel like those are maybe a little more likely and a little more dramatic than the things that could go right.
Well, let's talk about how we got to this point. Rick, I noted that Ben Rhodes wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times. Here's part of what it reads. We are not meant to think too much about the basis for action, how much it costs, or what happens after the spectacle of bombs falling. Before we digest the last operation, there is the threat of a new one. The dizzying nature of these actions makes them seem routine. War, he writes, should never be normal. Which leads me to the question of whether you think the Trump playbook, which is sort of driving unrelenting news cycles and then the exhaustion it causes, so people's outrage, they just don't have even the energy for it. Will that work with war?
Well, I hope that's not the case this time, Chris. I mean, unintended consequences, the first law of war. But the most important definition, Chris, is that America First, which is what he ran on, which is the Trump brand, equals zero wars. That's how voters understood it. I mean, Bill made a reference to the Iraq War. I mean, Donald Trump went on and on about the neocons getting us involved in building nations abroad and not helping the domestic economy. That is Donald Trump's brand. And I think you're seeing a lot of Republicans and MAGA Republicans twisting themselves to support the president, but feeling sort of befuddled, like, this is exactly what you ran against. This is exactly what you've talked against since 2003. So, I don't know that I've ever publicly agreed with Tucker Carlson on anything, but the fact that he said this is going to shuffle the deck in a profound way, I really do agree with.
Well, Bill, the poll I mentioned is from Reuters. It was conducted after the strikes began. Only 27% of Americans approve of the attack on Iran. It is a polar opposite of what he said on the campaign trail. He did not go to Congress, and he did not go to the American people. Arguably, he has still not gone to the American people. He has not answered questions in a public way. Do you think that is resonating with the American people in a way that maybe some of the other moves that he's made that people have shrugged and said, well, that's Donald Trump being Donald Trump? Is this different?
Of course it is. We've already lost, unfortunately, 4 servicemen or women. We've lost some planes. There will be further. I'm worried if the war goes quite a while, there'll be further losses. There'll be further expenses. What Ron was talking about, oil prices and energy, the markets don't react until they react, right? And what if, the Strait gets closed or more oil facilities get hit in the Gulf? And I mean, I just think wars are very unpredictable. And a lot of the things that could be, you can get lucky, right? You could have a nice popular uprising a popular uprising in Iran and a decent government put in and a real sense of liberation. You can also have an awful lot of things go wrong. So I think that's what voters will react to. There's some parts of the MAGA coalition, someone like Tucker Carlson, who's very, committed to this idea of America First and beyond America First, I think, that who will turn against Trump. I think he's got a pretty good stranglehold on the Republicans in Congress for now. But look, I think if this thing goes on for quite a while and the war spreads and there's not a satisfactory resolution and no one understands why we had to do it, that's the other point I would make. Iraq was soon after 9/11, and there was a sense of connection there. And then there were the claims of weapons of mass destruction. Iran was no threat to us. And I say this as someone who has been a long-time critic and hater of the Iranian regime and have been open to military force. But you've got to go to the country then and say, look, we need to stop Iran for various reasons. Here they are. We need support to do this. We need a congressional vote to do this. Trump is out there on a limb. And if he hasn't made the case for the war and the war goes badly, I think you'd see an across-the-board drop in Trump's numbers. And I agree with you on this, Chris. It's much more risky for him than a normal issue. Something goes wrong with healthcare or even the economy in an incremental way, even ICE, getting out of control and being horrible. Even that's a point, 2, 3 points maybe. You get a war that goes badly in a serious way, the bottom could fall out.
Well, we did note, and I don't want to make too much of this, really, but Rick, when I was watching the ceremony for the Americans who fought, 2 of whom died, 1 of whom performed valiantly in the conflicts in Afghanistan, as well as Vietnam. I've been in that room, incredibly emotional. And then as he's talking about that and talking about the conflict now, the war in Iran, he turns to the color of the curtains and them being gold. And again, Trump being Trump, but I wonder if there is a point at which people do escalate the way they look at these things because American lives are in danger.
And Chris, I think this is what you're alluding to. He doesn't really even have the language to talk about it. When he had his brief press conference and his video on Truth Social, he in an almost backhanded way, he said, casualties are one of the things that happens in war. That's what happens. And so I have always found him unable to use the kind of language that American presidents, including George Bush, used about people who make that ultimate sacrifice, so the last full measure of devotion to the country. I think Americans want to hear that. They don't want to hear a kind of casual thing, well, people die in war and you have to get used to it and the ends justifies the means. So I agree with Bill's point. If the war goes badly, it'll have a catastrophic effect on him. But the bias that his voters have and the bias that conservatives have is not to do this at all, to not get engaged from the start, not risk a bad outcome. I hope and pray that there isn't a terrible outcome. I hope and pray that Iran becomes a Jeffersonian democracy, but the likelihood of that is very slim.
Bill Kristol, Richard Stengel, thank you both, gentlemen.